in the first place with mouse mesh?
I mean, a couple of things that I've noticed since was with Credo Mutter, where I saw a later interview, which was actually done by Bill Ryan. That's the Bill Ryan of the Project Camelot and Project Avalon.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really curious because Bill Ryan had taken along a book by Michael Tellinger, who's written quite a lot and spoken quite a lot about these ancient African stone ring structures in South Africa. And he's also spoken about what he thinks is the oldest, one of the oldest sort of arrangements of stones that's, you know, got purpose, which is Adam's calendar. I've met Michael Tellinger on one occasion, and he's actually had the gumption to actually hold up Dr. Judy Wood's book at one of his talks and tell people that they should read the Where Did the Towers Go book. So that is obviously, to me, seems like a plus point. And why I'm sort of connecting those things is because having listened to those Credo Mutter interviews that 5 hours long, he comes across as very sort of mild, meek, you know, quite measured in what he's saying, and this, as you described. But yet, when he sees this book by Michael Tellinger going through these stone structures and what Michael Tellinger thinks they are some type of structure which harvests energy from the earth, I hope I'm not misquoting him, but the common explanation for these structures is that they are, you know, cattle herding rings. They're just remains of where they herded cattle and stuff, you know. But Michael Tellinger says they're much older than when there was that sort of agriculture going on. But Credo Mutter has shown pictures by Bill Ryan in Michael Tellinger's book, and he's looking at them and he said, "Oh, this is bullshit," you know. And I'm thinking, well, why does he need to say it's bullshit? I've never heard him swear like that. Why doesn't he explain why Michael Tellinger is wrong? You know, I mean, basically what I'm saying is when somebody just says, "Oh, that's bullshit," it's like a very weak argument. You know, why can't he say what they were? You know,
on Wikipedia, I'll just read this extract about David Icke. It says Richard Kahn and Tyson Lewis argue that the reptilian hypothesis may simply be Swiftian satire, a way of giving ordinary people a narrative with which to question what they see around them. So that they're saying that they're symbolic, they're not real, the reptilian thing. But I would disagree with that, at least in 1998. I think David Icke had been led to believe that there were human beings on the planet that could shapeshift into reptiles. Now, I don't put any criticism on David Icke for that, because if the CIA were looking at David Icke in 1997, because he's exposing the Oklahoma City bombing, and then he went on to expose the Diana thing and many other things, you know, the Rockefellers and the hidden government, the Council on Foreign Relations, he was becoming more and more popular. If that operation could have involved a lot of people and a lot of money spent on it.
Yes,
you got an opinion on that, Andrew?
Well, you know, definitely, and I think that kind of links into something that I remember reading in about 2004 or so, when I started to get back into all the UFO material, was around about 2003, and I very quickly came across the David Icke stroke reptilian stuff, which I wasn't aware of before that, really. And I came across one interesting post, and you probably still find it if you look for it. There used to be a list called UFO Updates, which was like a news update list, obviously. And I came across this post, which was entitled "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of Ufology," and it listed a number of the well-known researchers who are still, you know, well-known now. You know, Stanton Friedman and Stephen Greer and Nick Redfern and David Icke, and it's quite an interesting read, actually. And for the entry on David Icke, you know, it's only like 3 or 4 lines on each person. The entry on David Icke says, you know, something along the lines of, "This passionate and effective speaker was derailed by disinformation people who got to him and convinced him about the reptilian race, and you know, he's gone to ridiculous lengths to say ridiculous things about the reptilians." You know, they didn't specifically mention the shape-shifting element in this entry, and of course I don't know who wrote this entry, But when I went down this list and I compared the list to my own notes, you know, of what I'd come to understand about the various researchers at that time, I tended to agree with them, you know, and particularly the entry on Stephen Greer, for example, which I think turned out to be accurate from my own research later on. So I just thought it was interesting that somebody had already pointed out in 2003 that they thought David Icke was right about a lot of stuff, essentially, but the reptilian stuff, you know, that had been put into his repertoire as a way of discrediting him, you know, and I think that's
right.
What it is.
My view is, I suspect, he was hit on probably by the CIA. He admits he was in touch with someone from the CIA around that time. And they've got limitless resources to send actors, and who wouldn't be persuaded by such a if that would have happened to you?
Yeah. I mean, if you're getting all those people coming up to you, I mean, I'm presuming that this was all on his tour of the US. So again, it's going to be easier for CIA, you know, employed people to target him while he's in the US. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't know how much he's got of this testimony from other places in the world, but even so, they can still do it globally. You know, they can still target him with these stories globally.
So it's not a criticism that the fact that I don't agree with them on the reptilian thing. There's a logical reason why that's happened.
I think so. Yes. And I think, you know, I'm certainly not saying that there aren't any reptilian alien beings that have, you know.
No.
I mean, in fact, I've had people coming up to me saying that they've encountered reptilian beings, but I don't. The shape-shifting thing certainly hasn't.
It's in my film UFOs and NATO. I meet a whistleblower or someone who's involved in UFO crash retrieval or recovery. You need to watch that film to get the whole gist of it, but that is what was claimed, that there was that was the way that they looked. Now, I don't know if that's true. It may be true, but as you say, I think people in positions of power, you and I, we've got the same chromosomal arrangement. We can only mate with and breed with a narrow set of, you know, people who are of your own species. And sorry, you can't shapeshift into a reptilian. But as I say, that's not a criticism. Now, so on the Andrew Neil show, Andrew Neil puts to David Icke, well, was 9/11 an inside job? I think he mentions 9/11. And I suspect that the likes of Andrew Neil and who's the other person on that show, Michael Portillo, they've got to know that 9/11 was an inside job.
I can see the point that you might have some question 9/11.
And he uses the reptilian thing to
blow that off,
to blow that whole 9/11 argument off the rails, using this reptile, the Queen's a reptile.
Yeah, they associate the 9/11, you know, suspicions with the reptilian disinformation, and that helps them to deal with the issue.
Yeah. But if you also think that Buckingham Palace is inhabited by lizards, it kind of undermines
but it's not.
it.
So, assuming we're correct that this was a CIA-led thing, it's still being used today.
Still being used today, yeah, and we're sort of nearly 15 years, 16 years on from that, aren't we?
Yeah.
And I think you know, the other thing which we were going to talk about was when he was asked about the reptilian issue in a recent interview. In that recent interview we'd spoken about, where, you know, he was asked directly, "Where's the evidence?"
Yeah, I can show that clip.
Well, I'm sure you teach your audience to question everything. So if somebody were to demand objective proof to substantiate your assertion of this, where would he go? I mean, where would you direct him?
Well, let's look at one word: teach. I'm coming to the United States in September. I'm speaking in New York. I'm speaking in Los Angeles, and I'm speaking in San Francisco. And I will speak with breaks, of course, from 10 in the morning till 10 in the evening. And there's 4 sections, all of which fit together, which go deeper and deeper and deeper in the rabbit hole as I go along. It includes the world that we see and how the world that we see is actually controlled, and some of the things and many, many more that we've been talking about. And then I go deeper and deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole. But what I am not doing, and I never do, is teach people anything. I do not require that they believe it. I do not set out to persuade them to believe me if it doesn't make sense. Because the last thing this world needs is someone else standing up and saying to people, this is how it is, and if you believe something else, you're wrong.
He starts talking about perception and about how it's going to take him too long to explain why there are shapeshifters and whatnot. And he also he's saying, well, you don't have to believe me.
Yeah, yeah. So in other words, he goes from talking about evidence to talking about belief, which is certainly for me is a big problem. You know, when you need to be clearly distinguishing between the two, between what is belief and what is evidence, and what you can show and prove. Like, for example, I don't think in his book he has any pictures of anybody, you know, a sequence of pictures of anybody turning into a reptilian being. He may have, you know, allusions to certain characters in films, you know, being reptilian characters. And I know I remember the science fiction series called V is mentioned, and he sort of uses that as evidence that yes, you know, there are these reptilians which changed into humans, and you know, some of his evidence is this science fiction TV series. Well, how good evidence is that? You know, I mean, it's I don't think it's really. It's not even evidence really. It's just you know, it's just an example of what possibly is some type of predictive programming, but we can't say that that's what the true situation is based on a science fiction show.
You've mentioned 9/11 and you've mentioned evidence. Okay, so we're going to come on to that now, because you've done extensive research into 9/11 along with Dr. Judy Wood, former professor of engineering mechanics, who has written the world's most detailed analysis of what happened, scientific study of what happened, all of the evidence of 9/11, where did the towers go.
Right.
Now, a very important book, and just tell us first, Andrew, how difficult have you found it to try and get that book onto the mainstream channels?
Well, I mean, you know, it's kind of impossible, really. I mean, it's not. You know, I wrote press releases about the research before the book was published because we had the court case before the book was published. So I tried to bring that to the attention of mainstream sources even before the book was published. So, you know, had I been successful in that, then maybe there would have been more interest in the book. But the mainstream media wasn't at that time, you know, so much the problem as the 9/11 truth movement. You know, and we've talked about that before on this program, and people can go back and watch those programs. But yeah, so it's down to other alternative websites, for example, like yours and a couple of others, to actually try and raise awareness of this book. And of course, as David Icke was, we were saying earlier, he was one of the first people to write a book which was sceptical of the official story of 9/11, and that book I think was published either very late in 2001 or early in 2002, and it was called Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center Disaster. And even in that book, I think there is some mention made, it's on one or two of the pages, of some type of energy weapon. So again, that's pretty extraordinary that David Icke was talking in those terms only, I think, less than a year after the destruction of the World Trade Center. Yeah,
that's what, 6 years before I even began to question it. So it's excellent.
Yeah,
the fact that he's come to the conclusion, probably through different evidence, i.e. his geopolitical analysis of the whole situation. But for him to glean that and put that in a book is incredible.
Yes, I mean he was you know, he was very much on the ball and still is in many ways. But what you know, why I bring that up was he then written quite a lot about 9/11 in some of his other books, as I understand it. But that brings us on to this meeting that I had with him, which was arranged through a mutual friend in 2008. And I met with David Icke at a hotel in Derby, as I said earlier in the programme. And, you know, I actually had a one-on-one meeting with him for 2.5 hours. And we talked about many things. He also told me that story that you'd mentioned earlier about the guy being patched by putting he had to put a tube of chemicals into his chest every 72 hours or something to keep himself alive. He told me that story. But we also spoke at some length about 9/11, because that was actually the main reason for me meeting him, because this mutual friend had suggested that I tell David about Dr. Judy Wood's research. And so I basically told him all that I knew then. And we're talking about April 2008. So this was about 2.5 years or so before the Where Did the Towers Go book came out. And so I had a laptop with me, and I showed him some of the pictures of the destruction of the buildings, as I recall. But one of the main things I definitely showed him was the pictures of Hurricane Erin, which of course was this hurricane which moved across the Atlantic, hit Bermuda on the 7th, moved up towards New York City in the 4 days prior to the events of 9/11, slowed down, and then on the 12th of September it made a right-hand turn and headed out towards Newfoundland. So anybody that's not aware of that information, I would advise them to check it out. There's various videos that Dr. Wood has made and I've made and stuff, and you can find all of that out. So I distinctly remember this. David Icke was sitting on the hotel bed, resting his legs, because as some listeners might know, he's got arthritis, so he suffers quite badly in some of his joints. He looked at this picture, and I explained to him what we thought the significance of this hurricane was, and it was to do with energy, basically. Obviously, because this provided the static field. And so he said that. He said, "Oh, this is all about energy, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, that's what I'm writing about." And I said, "Well, here you go then. This is I essentially implied that this should be really significant to what he was writing about, and fitting that into his whole picture of energy, consciousness."
So at that point in time, he could have incorporated Dr. Judy Wood's work into his lectures, as he incorporated Credo Mutwa or Arizona Wilder or whatever other information he's come across.
And I mean, immediately after that, I had no contact from him. I mean, he seemed interested, very interested, but he didn't say, "Oh, can I have your email address and can we talk more about this?" I didn't get any of that. But I felt that I'd made enough of an impression of him, on him, for him to go off and research that for himself, and then he would probably have contacted us if he needed to. I would have thought he had his own research resources that he could have drawn upon to, package that in the way that he would have felt appropriate to his work. Mm-hmm. But instead, what happened was his next book came out, I think in 2010, which was, I think it was the book Human Race, Get Off Your Knees. And he does talk about 9/11 in that book, but what does he talk about? He talks about controlled demolition of the World Trade Center, which I'd explained to him was not what happened. And I'd had no contact with him since then, So the next thing to add to the story after that, in relation to this 9/11 issue, was that I can't remember how this happened, but he was interested in getting the Where Did the Towers Go book listed on his own website as part of one of the collection of books that he sold. Because he sells his own books, and then I think he sells a few other books like Christopher Dunn's book on the pyramids, Giza power plant, and various things like that. And I think the request came from the person that helps to organise his website and so forth, because he doesn't organise the website himself. He does have a number of people helping him. And we made this arrangement that he would sell the Where Did the Towers Go book for a certain price.
Yeah, as I do on my website.
As we've done with Richard, with your website. And so he got a discount, etc. And I was personally shipping out the orders that came from David Icke. So David Icke would send the orders to me. or not David Icke personally, but the people that run his website would send his orders to me, and I would then dispatch the books to the person concerned, and then we'd bill them for whatever copies were sold. So, and that arrangement probably went on for a couple of years, and then the last time I looked, the Where Did the Towers Go book was no longer listed on David Icke's website, and I'd certainly had no feedback as to say, oh well, it was too expensive, or we weren't selling any, or nothing. We'd given no reason why this was taken off the website. So I found that very peculiar.
Okay. Now, there's often disagreement on 9/11. In particular, as you mentioned there, controlled demolition. We've got the work of Dr. Judy Wood, which even just the videos and the photographs, we can see the towers are turning to dust in midair. There's so many pieces of evidence which tell you that the towers were turned to dust in situ before they hit the ground, which controlled demolition can't do that. Neither can a pancake collapse. But the argument rails, and some people maybe don't want people who are researching these things to have arguments.
That's it. And I mean, we've got this other clip of David Icke from November last year, which you and I had discussed on the Richie Allen show, saying just that.
Right, we'll take a look at that.
For instance, 9/11. All we need to agree on about 9/11 is that it was created on purpose to provide the excuse for what has followed. That's all we need to agree on. We don't need to agree on whether this substance brought the towers down or these energy weapons. That might be interesting, but we don't need to agree on that. We don't need to argue over it. We don't need to come into conflict over it like children.
Yeah, it's madness.
All we need to agree on is the obvious. 9/11 was created as an excuse for all that's followed. Okay, got there. Let's move on. Again, it's seeing the picture and not getting caught in the dots and the bubble, because 9/11, Rich, in the alternative media has become for many people a bubble, arguing about whether it's an energy weapon or whether it's this bloody substance that brought the towers down, whether the planes were this or whether it was a bloody holographic illusion, all this stuff. It doesn't matter. It's interesting, but it doesn't matter.
What do you make of that then?
Well, I mean, I was kind of shocked when I saw that, actually, because my immediate impression was that, and feeling from seeing that clip, was that David Icke has spent many years explaining to people how they should think for themselves, and the same as you and I, essentially saying the same as you and I do, Richard, on these programs that we've done. Here's the evidence, you think about it, you make your own judgment, etc., etc. But David Icke in that clip is talking about childishness, and he's saying that we don't need to look at the evidence, we just need to agree that the official story of 9/11 is false. So that in of itself is very strange. The way he's saying it is strange, and he's saying that, on this you don't really need to think for yourself, you can just take my word for it and don't have arguments.
Well, just to expand on that, let's just say there was only one person killed, and let's say it wasn't a bizarre building collapse, it's just a dead body lying on the floor, and you've got some people who suspect it might have been a murder by someone over there, and you've got two groups, one saying, well, I think he's died, he's been shot. The other group saying, well, no, he's been poisoned, and they're arguing with each other over how the person was killed and what happened. They're arguing with each other. And you've got a third person saying, look, it doesn't bloody matter. We know it was them over there. It doesn't matter. Stop arguing. We know it was them over there, and we know why we killed him. So we don't need to investigate it.
That's right.
Now, if you don't investigate what happened and how that person was killed, the exact mechanism, how can you possibly persuade anyone else who's not aware of it that it was a murder? You need to find out what happened.
Absolutely. And
we know that there's not really a court in the world that's going to deal with it. You're not going to get it into court because the people who've probably perpetrated it control the courts.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
But if you could get it into a court, you would have to explain how it was done, and if you couldn't, the perpetrators would get off.
Exactly.
But in order to spread the word that it was a fabricated event and it wasn't terrorists with box cutters, you have to explain how it was done. And if there are people who are diverting from how it was done, then, you know, sometimes unwittingly, then an argument must be had.
Yes, indeed.
And it's the most important argument.
Yes, and I think to add to that as well, Richard, you know, going back to that meeting I had with him where he said he was talking about energy, and we've talked about, you know, we mentioned earlier how he was talking about perception. David Icke was talking about perception, and how we have this sort of type of reality that we live in, and you know, there's these various dimensions and so forth. So when you start to look into the research, for example, of John Hutchison, and how the energy effects that he's created manifest themselves, again, that ties into that territory very, very strongly. So you would have thought that David Icke would have been all over that material to integrate it into what he was saying about the nature of reality, because basically what I'm saying, you know, in terms of 9/11, is, as I've said before, is that what happened to those towers was essentially engineering the ether, the underlying ether of our reality has been engineered to make those materials do what they did. So that is all to do with energy. It's to do with the underlying sort of reality, the underlying ether of our physical reality, which again is right in line with the sorts of things David Icke has talked about. So why isn't he talking about it?
Right. Well, let me just give you a hypothetical situation. David Icke's sitting in that TV studio with Andrew Neil, and he asks him about 9/11, and all David Icke does is pull that book out of his briefcase. There you go, Andrew. It's all in there, and show it on the screen. Now, we know that that would be edited out.
Yes,
right?
indeed.
But that really is what should be brought to the table in the mainstream if it can be done.
Yes, and I mean, I think, you know, people have heard me say these sorts of things about other researchers, not just David Icke, but the same in this particular case can be said of David Icke, you know, as of the other researchers, that David Icke, as far as I'm concerned, has become part of the 9/11 cover-up. You know, he is covering up what has happened on 9/11 because he wants to criticise those who want to talk about the evidence of the destruction of the World Trade Center rather than actually understand the evidence for himself.
People might counter what you and I are saying by saying, well, you're just pushing one argument. Well, the reason why I push that argument and argue for Dr. Judy Wood's research is I've read the book, right? I've watched lectures by Richard Gage and others. I've seen all of the, I've seen the Russian guy who says it was done by nukes. I've looked at all the evidence. I've evaluated that evidence, and I think that's what happened, right? So I'm going to argue that way because I think that's what the evidence points to. Someone else has looked at all the evidence and thinks it was something else, then fair enough. But you can't not have the argument. You have to have the argument, and if someone's being unfair when they are debating, in other words, they are a shill put up by an agency in order to disrupt, that must be pointed out as well.
Absolutely.
Right? So you have to have a fair discussion. Now, where's the arbiter? Where's the judge? In this alternative community, whatever you want to call it, there is no judge, there is no arbiter, is there?
No.
There's no one to sit there and say, you've gone over the top with that or what have you, to say, well, to judge who really is talking about the evidence and who's closest to the evidence. You
know, but I think going back to that clip, it's unusual that he would describe this as sort of childish nonsense in terms of the language that he was using, and actually it's a discussion of the evidence which is used to establish what happened. It's used to establish the truth. And so that was something that didn't come up in the statement by David Icke. And that was on the Richie Allen show. You know, and I started to talk about Richie Allen, I've also been on his program to say these very things. And he's had this, you know, the Richard Gage character on his programs, both for the People's Voice and his other programs that Richie Allen has done. Yet, you know, he won't accept that is disinformation, and we can prove that it's disinformation.
In summary, if you're going to get the bastards, you have to know what they did.
Yes.
Specifically what they did.
Yes. And we knew what they did by 2007 because that's why it was taken to court. And this is another thing which is often overlooked. You know, Dr. Judy Wood did the research by 2007. She had enough evidence to take to court, which she did. Now, that evidence was never really heard in a court. That's the important distinction that we're making here between, you know, writing a book about possible reptilian influence in our culture and all those other things. You know, like, for example, as I said earlier, we had in David Icke's book a very good discussion of the assassination of Diana, yet none of that was ever taken to court. He never took any of that to court. You know, this was the difference between what Dr. Judy Wood did and what many of the other researchers and authors have done. That's why, you know, every time I come on this program, I want to re-emphasize that point to make sure that I get that point across to people of how important and how powerful that evidence is.
Okay then, Andrew, thanks for joining me today, and I'm sure we'll record some more material on completely different subjects. Thank you. And remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.
This program was sponsored by Mouse Mesh. Problem: mouse in your